Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with my Oxford World's Classics bookshelf tour. So essentially this is just my collection of the Oxford World's Classics. And I will say this is my quickest growing collection of classics. I actually really love the newer Oxford World's Classics editions. The most popular video on my channel is all about me discussing which editions of classics I like the most. I'm still shocked that that video is so popular, but in it I slam pretty harshly the Oxford World's Classics editions, and that is because at the time of filming it I had not yet experienced the joy that comes with the newer Oxford World's Classics, and I am utterly obsessed with them. But this is kind of continuing my bookshelf tour that is happening slowly but surely. A couple of months ago, I did my Penguin Classics collection, and so essentially I did a bookshelf tour of all of the Penguin Classics that I have on my shelf. I have far more Penguins than I do Oxford World's Classics, but I have read far more of the Penguins than I have the Oxfords because I am kind of in my collecting phase right now, and so when I want to read something new, I am very interested in picking it up in an Oxford World Classic edition. I do have a few of the older editions, so let's get those out of the way first. They are in no particular order, and I've actually gotten rid of the majority of the ones that I had. I have a real issue with how these older ones are made. I don't think that they are very well formatted, and I also think that their text can be a little bit difficult to read. One that I will never get rid of, but I constantly am thinking about whether or not I want a new edition of this, and that's the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. So I read it in this edition and I tabbed it. This is actually the first book that I ever annotated outside of school, and this is one of my favorites of all time. Alexander Dumas is one of my favorite writers of all time, and so I kind of hate that I read it in this edition, but this edition is actually very nice and floppy. But I'll show you what I'm talking about with the text. You might can see that the typeface is just a little bit difficult to read. It's as if they use an older typeface in these editions, and I don't think that that's actually very readable, but this is one of my favorites of all time, and I highly recommend it, and I do recommend that you get it unabridged. There are a lot of, unfortunately, abridged editions out there, some of which don't actually advertise that they are abridged, so I would recommend that you get the full beast that is the Count of Monte Cristo. One that I have not yet read is actually Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope. I am really excited to carry on with Anthony Trollope. I have only read one thing by him, and that was The Warden. I believe this is the first book in another series of his, so I would like to finish the series that I started with The Warden, the Barsetshire Chronicles, before I start this one. I also have The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. This was a DNF, actually, but it was a DNF because I knew I wasn't in the mood for it at the time, and I know I'm really going to love it. I know I'm really going to enjoy her. This is a classic of Gothic fiction that was written in the 1700s, and I just have a really good feeling about it. Next we have Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This is one of my favorites. This is really one of my favorite Victorian classics of all time. It might just be a favorite book of mine. This is a really wild ride, and I highly encourage everyone to pick it up. If you really like kind of the sensation novel style, this is a sensation novel, and I think it's one of the best in that genre. I also have Lorna Doone, and Lorna Doone is another DNF of mine, mostly because I hate this edition. So I'm looking to get rid of this edition and maybe update it to the more modern Oxford World's Classics. But again, you see the text problem. And actually, these editions, these older editions, are a little bit hard to keep open, in my opinion. They're hard to hold in your hand and keep open without cracking the spine, which I know some people are precious about. And actually, I kind of am. I can be a little bit precious about it because I don't like a book to automatically open to one part every time I open the book. But I have a really good feeling about Lorna Doone as well. I got pretty far into it and I was really loving it when I decided I just couldn't anymore because of the format. But now we are on to the more modern Oxford World's Classics, which I love. I am obsessed with them. And these should be in chronological order. I know I said that about my Penguin Classics, and they absolutely were not in any sort of chronological order, but these actually should be. I promise you that they should be. The first of these is Medea by Euripides, which is one of my favorite of the ancient Greek plays. This edition also includes a few other plays, and actually, I'll tell you what they are in case you're curious. Hippolytus, Electra, and Helen. But Medea is probably the most famous of those, and it's really, really good. If you have never read Medea, gosh, you're in for it. You are really in for something if you don't know what's coming. I really, really love Medea. This is one of my favorites from the ancient Greek plays. Unfortunately, that's the only ancient Greek work that I have thus far in the Oxford World's Classics, but I've heard such amazing things about their translations. I've heard that the translations of ancient classics in particular are really, really wonderful in this edition of classics, and so I am very curious to get more ancient classics in this line. But moving on to the Roman world, and I also have very few in the Roman world here, I have the complete poems of Catullus, who I have never read. And it's always shocked me that Catullus is one that I've never come across elsewhere. Catullus is probably one of the most famous of the ancient Roman poets. And so I'm really shocked given my background because I was kind of a classics major for a time. I was also a Latin student. I'm just really shocked that I never came across him in school. But a lot of people really, really love his work. And it's very short, and it actually includes the Latin on the opposite page. And so I love that. But you will probably notice in some of these, if you were debating on these editions, some of these do keep that kind of older font that I was talking about with the older editions of the Oxford World's Classics. And so really, if that bothers you, I don't know. I can't tell you that there's any rhyme or reason to it. So if that does bother you, maybe this isn't the line for you. Maybe you really do want to stick with the Penguins because they're pretty linear in terms of font, I think. Next, I have the complete Odes and Epodes by Horace, and Horace is one of my favorite ancient Roman poets. He might be in my top 3. He's definitely in my top 5. And this artwork on the cover is one of my favorite paintings of all time. There it is. There it is up close. And that's the Roses of Heliogabalus. So it's a really, really beautiful painting. Horace is a very biting poet, and there's also quite a bit of humor in his poetry. Next, we have a new addition to my collection, which is the major works of Anselm of Canterbury. Saint Anselm was a religious thinker from the Middle Ages. He lived during the 1000s, and he lived a very interesting life. He actually traveled quite a bit for somebody who lived during that time period. And so he wound up in Canterbury, and he's a little bit of a precursor in many ways to Thomas Becket in that he had a real contention with the King of England in a similar way. And so he's a really interesting figure in his own right, but apparently his writing is really beautiful. And so I'm looking forward to diving into his collection of religious writings. This is one that I doubt I will read straight through. Continuing on in the Middle Ages, we have my personal favorite, Dante. So this is the Divine Comedy in the Oxford World's Classics edition, and this translation is done by C.H. Sisson, and I'm pronouncing his name like he's French, but I'm actually not sure that he is. But his translation is not my favorite. I think it's a little bit clunky in places, though it is serviceable. I'll call it serviceable. I do think it's readable and I think it's understandable, but I think the real value in this edition comes from the notes. There are a lot of really wonderful maps and charts and tables kind of telling you where different figures are in different circles of hell, purgatory, heaven, and it does include all 3 canticles of the Divine Comedy in this edition, which I also really appreciate. Here's where the notes start. There's a good 100 pages of notes at the end, but it is in notes essentially for each canto, and some people really despise flipping to the back for endnotes. So if you're looking for an edition of Dante and that bothers you, this might not be the one, but it is really, really beautiful. This is one of my favorite portraits of Dante. This is done by an anonymous artist in the 1500s, I believe. Just a really beautiful, bright edition of his work. So now we are moving out of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, kind of a very fast tour through the ancient world in the medieval period. I do have a lot of ancient and medieval classics in my Penguins collection, but I have again heard very good things about the translators for Oxford World's Classics, so it does make me kind of curious to see on a comparison level who does it better. But moving into the Renaissance, I have Orlando Furioso by Ludovico Ariosto. And this is a really famous Italian classic that is of epic poetry, so I know that I'm probably really gonna like it. I've also DNF'd this because I really wasn't getting into it. I think I just need to be in the right headspace, but I will tell you, they translate this into prose. instead of verse. And that's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine with poetry, but I understand why they did it. Certainly space is a factor in this regard. But I tend to really like Italian epic poetry in particular, and epic poetry just in general. So I'm really excited about this, and this is on my yearly TBR, so I should be getting to it fairly soon. Another work of Italian epic poetry from the Renaissance is Torquato Tasso's The Liberation of Jerusalem. And I am so excited about this. Words can't express it. I would have picked this up a long time ago, but many people have told me to read Orlando Furioso first, because this kind of builds on the tradition that Orlando Furioso was playing with. And so this is also epic poetry, and this takes place during the First Crusade, I believe, while Orlando Furioso takes place during the age of Charlemagne. This is translated into verse, and a lot of people have asked me, do I prefer poetry in the Oxford World's Classics edition? Because you'll see when we get there, nearly all of my poetry I have in this edition, and I do. I really prefer to get poetry in an Oxford World's Classics, because they just give you so much room to play. They give you a lot of room in the margins, and typically I think their notes are very good for poetry. So I'm really excited about this one. This is always talked about in conjunction with Orlando Furioso, so it does seem pertinent to me to read one and then the other kind of immediately afterwards. This is also a really beautiful cover. This is a painting of two of the characters from the Liberation of Jerusalem, and so it is just absolutely beautiful. I really tend to love the artwork that they choose to place on these editions. Here's the exception to that. This is the major works of Sir Philip Sidney. This just kind of gives me the creeps. It's just a little bit soulless, their eyes, because this is a tapestry, I believe. This is a collection of works by a poet who was never recognized as a poet in his own lifetime, Sir Philip Sidney. He was an English courtier, and he was mostly known for that, but he really wanted to be known as a poet. When he died very young, at 31, in battle, I believe, his works were dispersed and they gained a lot of popularity. So he got in death really what he wanted in life, which is always a little bit sad, but I'm really excited to read more of him. I liked what I've seen so far. This is a period that is a bit of a sweet spot for me with poetry. I tend to like nearly everything that was written in the 1500s in terms of poetry. It was just a really great time. So he was a really interesting person, and his work is also very interesting. Next, in terms of the Renaissance, we have one of my current reads, and that is the King James Version of the Bible. This version includes the Apocrypha, and it is massive. It's absolutely massive. Again, the artwork is stunning. This is Jeremiah, I believe. It's a detail from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So this was done by Michelangelo. Sometimes you just see the work of Michelangelo and you have to just say, wow. Sometimes there are no words for it. There are really no words for this one. I mean, look at that. Isn't it just beautiful? Look at the color. Genuinely beautiful. I am currently really obsessed with this. I think this is a really wonderful Bible to get if you are a student, and I also think it's just a really wonderful portable Bible to have on hand. I've really wanted one that was a little bit more portable, so this is the one that I chose. The introduction alone is incredible. It's incendiary, it's really wonderful, and it really looks deeply not just at the text of the Bible, but it looks pretty deeply at the construction of the King James Bible as a political tool as well, which I think is very fascinating because the King James Bible is so instrumental in terms of the English language. Here's how it's set up. I think you do wish there were more notes, but there are some really wonderful maps at the back, and there is also a little summary of each book of the Bible at the back as well. So it does have some notes, but I think you think in an edition like the Oxford World's Classics that you were going to get something really detailed and really scholarly. Unfortunately, that's not the case because, as you might can see, I believe they were confined by space, but this is my current read. I'm currently reading Genesis. I don't intend to read all of this in one go, but I am just really obsessed with it right now. Next, we have Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. This is a novel of the 1700s, and it's actually one of the first novels. It was really instrumental and really influential on kind of the modern book, the modern novel. Henry Fielding in particular kind of paved the way for what we think of as the modern book. And so I really appreciate what this does in terms of literary history. It's a very funny, bawdy kind of book. And in terms of its influence, I'm really quite shocked we don't hear more about it. Next, we have Roxana by Daniel Defoe. Daniel Defoe is an author that I think I really like. I've only read one thing by him, but I feel very confidently that Roxana is going to be for me, just based on what I've heard a lot of other people saying. This was his last novel, and I believe it's about a fallen woman, so I'm really interested to see what he does with that. Next, I have another of my current reads, and this is The Monk by Matthew Lewis. So this is another classic of Gothic fiction from the late 1700s, and this book is crazy. I don't really know how to describe it to you because it is just so absolutely insane. But this is a book that actually got Matthew Lewis pulled from Parliament, if I'm not mistaken. He's somebody who was on track for a really great political career, and this book was so poorly received, and it offended so many people that essentially it ruined his life. But this is a really interesting classic of Gothic fiction, and I actually am really enjoying it. It feels weird to say, but I am enjoying it. Next, we have Dangerous Liaisons by Chaudelarot de Laclos, and this is a classic of French literature. I got this used, and I have always been a little bit skeptical of it because a lot of people whose reviews I trust, they did not like this. And there are elements of it, I think, in terms of stylistic choice, that I think I won't like. So this is one that I've actually been very apprehensive about, but it is an epistolary novel, I believe, and those tend to work really well for me. So in that regard, I'm kind of interested in it, but I would love to hear what your opinion is on Dangerous Liaisons down below. Next, we have The Romance of the Forest by Anne Radcliffe. This is another classic of Gothic fiction. Gothic fiction is some of my favorite, especially classic Gothic fiction, and I just have the sense that Anne Radcliffe is going to become a favorite writer. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe The Mysteries of Udolpho will prove me wrong, but I do have the sense that I'm really going to get on with her as I get further into her work. This is a shorter one, so if you're looking for a place to start with her, this might be the place rather than The Mysteries of Udolpho, which is something like 750 pages long. Next, I have Mary and the Wrongs of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft is famous for being kind of an early feminist thinker. She's most famous for The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which I don't own an edition of. But this is actually a sequel of sorts to The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. These are both very semi-autobiographical, I would say. I think that Mary Wollstonecraft is a really interesting figure. I don't know that her writing actually gets on with me, sadly enough. Now let's officially move into what we will just call the poetry section. We've already seen a lot of poetry thus far, but this is my collection of the Romantic poets. So the first of these that I have is the major works of William Wordsworth. Unfortunately, I don't believe Oxford does any of the complete works of any of the Romantic poets. In some cases, I think it could be done. In William Wordsworth's case, it could not. He's one of the few of the Romantics that actually lived a long life, and so he actually had the opportunity to kind of write poetry throughout his life, and so there are definitely lows and highs, whereas with somebody like Keats, you basically get all highs because he died so young. And so I'm very forgiving of William Wordsworth in that regard, but some of his later work doesn't really jive with me. The natural progression from Wordsworth is to Coleridge, who I really like. I really enjoy Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The one thing I will say about this edition, though, is that the person who decided to put this collection together decided that you didn't need any notes, that you probably shouldn't have notes because Samuel Taylor Coleridge never intended you to kind of flip to endnotes to interpret what he was saying. And of course that's true because he was writing to a current audience. He was never probably intending 200 years on for people to be reading his works. So in some ways I have a real problem with that, because with other Romantic poets and certain poems, I've definitely needed those notes to catch specific references to their time period. I do really love the Romantics. This earlier generation has been a bit of a struggle for me compared to the kind of second generation of the Romantics. I don't think that Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth compete for a second with someone like Lord Byron. So let's move into that generation, my favorite generation of the Romantics, and we will start with probably, I want to call him my favorite, but I don't think he is. That's Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy Bysshe Shelley was the first of the Romantics that I ever explored, and this was actually my first of the new Oxford World's Classics editions. So I got this and fell in love because look how good it is. It's so floppy and wonderful. And I really, really enjoy what I've read from Percy Bysshe Shelley. I really love his writing. I really love him as a person, which I think kind of influences my opinion on his poetry. But I have read now quite a bit from a few other of the Romantics, and I don't know that I can call him my favorite anymore. He still feels a bit like a personal favorite to me. He still feels very personally close to me as a poet, but I certainly haven't read everything that he has to give. I haven't read some of his plays, which I'm really excited about. So Percy Bysshe Shelley definitely could become my actual favorite romantic poet, but I will tell you who my favorite is right now. My favorite right now is Lord Byron. So this is also the major works of Lord Byron. So much is not included in here that I wish was, and so much is included in here that you really, really want. I really want a comprehensive collection of everything done by Lord Byron, his letters, his poetry, his prose. I want it all. You can see here how much space you get in the margins to make your notes. It's just a really wonderful addition of poetry, and Lord Byron is my favorite romantic poet right now. I really don't know if it'll change because Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, it's top 3 for me, top 3 of all time in terms of epic poetry. So I'm a bit of a Lord Byron fangirl, but this is one of my favorites in the Oxford World's Classics. I just think it's a really comprehensive edition. I do wish that it included all of his works, but I understand that really wasn't doable. So these collections of romantic poetry are actually my favorites, and they actually are probably some of my favorite books that I own. I just really, really love the collections of poetry, specifically for the Romantics. So next we have Keats, who I am slowly but surely falling in love with. I've been a little bit skeptical about Keats. I also really like him as a person because he strikes me as somebody who should have been a historian in another life, and so I think I connect with him on that level. There's a real hype factor with Keats for me. A lot of people rate Keats very highly. A lot of people will only place Shakespeare above him in terms of importance in English literature, and so I just think I go into his poetry expecting to be wowed in a way that I don't with the others. So it does kind of make me struggle a little bit with him, but I do really, really enjoy what I've seen from Keats so far. Really genuinely beautiful work. In terms of the other Romantics, I do have The Vampire and Other Stories by Dr. John Polidori. So Dr. John Polidori was a romantic figure. He was actually Lord Byron's doctor. And he was in the house the night that Lord Byron said, "Write me a ghost story." And he and Mary Shelley are the two who actually did. They committed to it, and they actually wrote a ghost story. So this is kind of the first modern vampire story, and it's really interesting. You really wish it could be longer because I just think the details could be juicy. There is a real haunting horror quality to it that I think is really wonderful, but it is more of a short story than a novella. And so this includes a lot of other short stories that were written and published in the same magazine that The Vampire was originally published in, and a lot of them are really good, and they're also by a lot of other romantic figures. Next I have The Last Man by Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley is one of my favorite classic writers. I really love everything I've read by her except for The Last Man. I DNF'd The Last Man because I was just really not enjoying it. I do think I need to come back to it with fresh eyes because so many people have told me that I will absolutely love it once it gets into the second half. So I'm hoping that that's true. This is one that kind of breaks my heart. I hate that I DNF'd it, and I hate that I didn't really like it. Moving on into the later 1800s, we have Belinda by Maria Edgeworth. I'm not quite sure when this was published. I want to say actually it was earlier than some of these romantic works, but I like to keep the romantics together. This is a really interesting novel, I believe, that is kind of always talked about alongside Jane Austen. If you like Jane Austen, then apparently you will like Maria Edgeworth. So I'm curious about it because I don't actually really care for Jane Austen. So I'm curious to see if I will actually really like Belinda. Next I have The Bride of Lammermore by Sir Walter Scott. And I think Sir Walter Scott is a favorite author of mine. And I really, really enjoy him. He's essentially kind of the founder of modern historical fiction. And so this is kind of a bit of a adventure novel that's also set in Scotland. I believe dark prophecies are at play. I have not yet read this one. This is on my summer TBR, so this is one that I hope to be getting to very soon, and I am really, really excited about. Next, we have The Marble Fawn by Nathaniel Hawthorne, which is the only American classic that I have. And the reason that I have this is because it takes place in Rome. This book actually essentially inspired the family photo album because it became so popular to get the Marble Fawn and walk around Rome and take your picture and insert it in the pages when the characters were at each site. It became very popular to do that, and so essentially that's why the family photo album was invented. There actually is a link between this book and that happening, and this is stunning. This is a 5-star book. It will be on my favorites of the year. I don't think everyone will like it. It's very expository. It's very explanation heavy. It's just so beautifully written, though, that you forgive it anything. I really thought too much was going on. I said, there's too much plot here, because I really just wanted to hear him describe the city of Rome in his absolutely beautiful writing. This was a stunningly written book. But again, I don't know that everyone will like it, but this is just such a beautiful book, and it is an absolute favorite of mine. Next, I have The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. I recently read this, and I thought it was just okay. I tend to really like Thomas Hardy, but this one was just kind of run-of-the-mill to me. I did listen to it a little bit on audiobook, though, and I think that that kind of sucked a bit of my enjoyment out of it. And I think had I just read it physically, I really would have enjoyed it. But Thomas Hardy and I get on because I think he is into some of the same things that I am. There's often some Norse mythology references in his books, so I always find it a delight to read him. I also think his description is really, really beautiful, and sometimes I also think that the plot gets in the way of it. Sometimes I just want Thomas Hardy to describe to me the flowers on the trees and how the wind is blowing across the grasses. Sometimes I just want to read his description of things rather than read an actual novel. So I should definitely probably pick up an edition of Thomas Hardy's poetry. I wonder if Oxford has a version of it. Next, I have Tales of Glasstown, Angria, and Gondel by the Brontes. And so this is the kind of juvenilia of the Bronte siblings. So when they were younger, the Brontes, Charlotte, Anne, Emily, and their brother Branwell, they all kind of created these fictional worlds and wrote stories in them. And sometimes Lord Byron is a character in these stories, and sometimes Wellington is a character in these stories. They're really, really interesting. I wouldn't necessarily say they're good. Some of them are really strong, but others are definitely, you know, just kind of things that they did to occupy the time. I think this is a really, really interesting collection, and I think it tells you a lot about their upbringing, things that they were interested in, and it also kind of shows you where they were going to go as writers. Next, I have Studies in the History of the Renaissance by Walter Pater. This is a classic of nonfiction that's really interesting. It's a very, very interesting work. I don't know that I would recommend it because it is just such a weird setup. It's very odd if you're used to reading kind of modern historical nonfiction. This is a very strangely set up work of nonfiction, and it's clearly very biased. He puts a lot of his kind of personal opinions on the page, and if you don't agree with them, I think you kind of struggle with it. I definitely didn't agree with some of the things he said. Others I definitely did agree with. So this is a very interesting, thought-provoking work, and it is still studied for art history degrees as far as I know, and I definitely see why. Next, I have No Name by Wilkie Collins, which is one of my favorites of Wilkie Collins's. That's not saying much because I've loved everything I've read by Wilkie Collins, and everything I've read by him I've given 5 stars. But I think that No Name is a difficult sell for some people. I think it's a strange one among his more famous works, and some people really, really don't get on with it, and I definitely see why. It's a really interesting case, but the female characters in this are so fabulous and they're so dynamic. I think that Wilkie Collins was just a really skilled writer, and he and I clearly think on the same wavelength because I've loved everything I've read by him thus far. Next, I have Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is very short. This is actually, I think, a children's classic, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm constantly saving this for a special occasion, and I'm never sure when that occasion will be because I'm very harsh on pirate books. A lot of people have told me that I will probably really like Treasure Island because I am so harsh on other pirate books. So I do feel like there's a level of hype on this. I'm looking forward to it, but I do feel like I'm expecting a lot from it. And I don't know if in a book this short, it can pack the punch that I want. Next, we have another of my current reads, and that is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. So I am currently reading this, and I am not all that far in it. This is the Maud translation of War and Peace, and I'm enjoying that so far. I really like what I've seen so far from War and Peace, but I don't know how I'm going to feel about it as it goes on. I don't know if I'm going to think that it is a new favorite book. So I'm interested to see how I will feel about the rest of it. And last but not least, I have the Foresight Saga by John Galsworthy. And so this is a more modern classic that I am really intrigued by. This is apparently a trilogy of books that's often packaged together. And I have never seen an adaptation of this. I have never read it. I actually don't know very much about what it's about, but this is one that I've always heard quite a bit about. A lot of people rate this quite highly, and so I'm really excited to try it, but I don't know if I want to read it straight through or if I want to take one book at a time. If you have read this one, please let me know your thoughts on it down below. So that is my collection of Oxford World's Classics. I do tend to just really like the artwork that they choose. The books tend to be a little bit more floppy in these newer editions. So I just really like what I've seen thus far from the newer Oxford World's Classics. And I would love to know down below if they are a line that you really enjoy, if you prefer Oxford over Penguin or Penguin over Oxford. And if you have read any of these, please let me know your thoughts on them down below. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.